The splinter dug deep, a searing line of pain under Alara Vance's thumbnail, but she bit down on her lip until she tasted copper and kept sawing. The frayed hemp rope was thick, woven with a horseman's cruel expertise, and it bit into the raw, chafed skin of her wrists with every desperate motion. She worked against the rough, splintered edge of the wooden crate she was bound to, the motion frantic and small in the suffocating confines of the storage lean-to. The air was a foul cocktail, thick with the ghosts of last night's sins, the sharp, clean scent of pine resin from the new-cut lumber of the walls, the cloying sweetness of spilled whiskey, and the bitter, lingering haze of cheap cigar smoke. It clung to the back of her throat, a taste she associated with her stepfather, Burke Talon, a man whose promises were as thin as the cards he cheated with. A coarse laugh echoed from the main room of the gambling shack, followed by the heavy thump of a chair hitting the floor. They were still in there, drinking away the morning, celebrating the transaction. The thought sent a jolt of pure, cold adrenaline through her, more potent than the pain. The final strand of rope gave way with a faint snap. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Her breath caught in her chest, listening. Only the same drunken murmuring. She worked her hands free, the burn of blood returning to her numb fingers excruciating. The coat, a threadbare wool thing someone had left behind, was snagged on a nail by the door. She grabbed it, pulling it around her bare shoulders. It was a flimsy shield, smelling of dust and another man's sweat, but it was a shield nonetheless. It was the difference between a desperate woman and a spectacle. She would not be a spectacle. The warped plank door creaked open just enough for her to slip through. She paused, a shadow among shadows, her eyes adjusting to the sliver of blinding daylight. Then she ran. She burst out of the shack and into the full, unforgiving glare of the cedar wash basin. The midday sun was a physical weight, a blacksmith's hammer on an anvil of baked earth. The heat struck her with the force of a blow, stealing the air from her lungs. A furious wind swept down from the high ridges, not cooling but searing, kicking up the fine red dust into stinging, swirling ribbons that whipped against her face and bare legs. The ground was a cracked mosaic of white alkali, so bright it hurt to look at. A thin, bright line of blood weeping from a cut on her heel left a stark, fleeting trail on the bleached earth, a tiny testament to her flight. She clutched the old coat tighter, the rough wool scratching her skin, her knuckles white. It was all that stood between her and the raw humiliation Burke had intended for her. Humiliation was part of the price, he'd told her, his breath sour with liquor, a lesson in value, her value. Far in the distance, a jagged silhouette tore the sky in two. Kestrel Bluff. It stood sharp and severe as a flint knife against the endless, washed-out blue. It was more than a rock formation. It was a promise. Beyond it lay Saguaro Pass, a treacherous but possible path out of this valley, out of this territory, out of the reach of Burke Talon and the man he'd sold her to. It was the only gap in the cage of mountains that surrounded her. Her feet, already bruised and cut, found a desperate, stumbling rhythm on the hard-packed ground. She ran not with grace, but with the jagged, panicked energy of a cornered animal. Every rustle of sagebrush, every cry of a hawk overhead, sounded like the thunder of approaching hooves. Her lungs burned, each breath a gasp of superheated air. The world dissolved into a blur of motion and pain, the pounding in her ears, the sting of sweat in her eyes, the relentless, punishing sun. She didn't know how long she ran, only that the gambling shack had shrunk to a dark speck behind her, and Kestrel Bluff seemed no closer than before. Just as her vision began to tunnel, the edges blurring into a gray haze, she saw it. It wasn't much. A low-slung adobe house, a windmill turning with a weary groan, a haphazard collection of corrals, Dry Lantern Ranch. The name was painted in faded letters on a piece of sun-bleached wood hanging crookedly from a post, and on the shaded porch of the house, a figure, a man, sitting perfectly still in a simple wooden chair, his hat pulled low, casting his face in deep shadow. He was just a silhouette, a quiet shape of solitude against the vast, empty landscape. his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Boone Ashford. She knew the name. A man who kept to himself. A rancher who'd bought the driest parcel of land in the county and somehow managed to pull a living from it. A man who, people said, had a past he didn't speak of. Hope, fierce and desperate, gave her a final burst of strength. She aimed for the ranch like a sailor aiming for a lone lighthouse in a storm. The gate, a simple affair of weathered poles, hung open on a single leather hinge. She staggered through it, and the moment she crossed from the blinding sun into the cool, dark shade of the porch, her legs gave out. The world tilted violently, and she fell, not onto hard-packed dirt, but into what felt like the sudden, blessed relief of a deep, cool well. She landed on her hands and knees, the rough-hewn planks of the porch pressing into her palms. Before she could even try to push herself up, the man was there. He moved with a surprising quickness, a fluid economy of motion that belied his stillness from moments before. He knelt beside her, but he didn't touch her. His hand hovered in the air just beneath her elbow. A silent question, a space she could accept or refuse. His presence was a solid, calming thing. "You're safe now," he said. "Wisha." The voice was low and steady, a gravelly sound that seemed unused to speaking. It held no pity, only a simple statement of fact. Slowly, Elara pushed herself into a sitting position, her back against a porch post. She kept her head down, unable to meet his eyes. The coat clutched around her like a prayer. He stood, and for a moment she thought he was leaving her there. Instead, she felt a heavier weight settle over her shoulders. He had taken off his own coat, a long canvas duster, and draped it around her. It was heavy and smelled of leather, dust, and clean air. The gesture was so unexpected, so profoundly decent, it almost broke her. It was the first act of kindness she'd known in a lifetime, offered by a stranger who had seen her at her lowest. In that one simple motion, she saw a lonely man remembering a gentleness he had long since packed away. From the direction she had come, the faint, rhythmic drumming of horses' hooves grew louder, then faltered. A man shouted, his voice distorted by the wind. Another answered. They were searching, but their pace was uncertain. They had lost the trail. The sound of the horses receded, moving away from the ranch, back toward the main track. She knew it wasn't the end. It was merely a reprieve, a fragile, borrowed pocket of time. "Come on," Boone Ashford said, his voice still quiet. He offered a hand, palm up, and this time, after a long hesitation, she took it. His grip was firm and calloused, but his touch was careful as he helped her to her feet. He led her through the front door and into a kitchen that was sparse, orderly, and impeccably clean. A cast-iron stove stood cold in one corner, pots hanging from hooks on the wall above it. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. There were no frills, no decorations, only the essential tools for living, each in its proper place. It was the kitchen of a man who lived a deliberate, pared-down life. He guided her to one of the chairs, and she sank into it, the heavy duster a comforting weight. He moved to a water barrel by the door, ladled some into a tin cup, and set it on the table in front of her. He didn't press her with questions. He simply sat down in the opposite chair and waited, his hands resting on the tabletop. She finally looked at him properly. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and time spent alone. His eyes, a clear, pale gray, were what held her. They were watchful, assessing, holding a deep-seated caution she recognized. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, the kind of wary vigilance she'd seen in old cavalrymen who still woke from dreams of battle. Elara drank the water. It was cool and clean, and it felt like she was washing away the filth of the gambling shack from the inside out. She drank it all, her hands shaking so much the cup rattled against her teeth. When she set it down, the silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a patient silence, a space for her to find her voice. When she finally spoke, the words came out in a dry, cracked whisper, a half-truth that felt safer than the whole. "I was payment for a debt," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the condensation beating on the tin cup. "My stepfather. He lost a game, but I don't belong to anyone." Boone Ashford just nodded slowly, his gray eyes never leaving her face. He didn't offer empty words of comfort or outrage. He simply accepted her statement, giving it the weight of truth. The world outside the small kitchen, with its shouting men and cruel bargains, felt 1,000,000 miles away. Her gaze drifted past him, toward the doorway leading back outside. Hanging from a thick wooden peg driven into the adobe wall was his gun belt. It was well-worn leather, the holster molded perfectly to the shape of the Colt revolver it held. It hung straight and heavy, a constant, silent presence. It was a tool of his world, a symbol of the violence that was never far away in this land. But seeing it there, set aside, hung on its peg by the door, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a promise that it would be used if it was needed to keep her safe, but that it would remain there, untouched, as long as what she needed was peace. His footsteps retreated from the kitchen and returned a moment later. Boone Ashford held out a folded square of blue fabric. It was a man's shirt, made of chambray, worn so soft the cotton was almost velvet, and faded by 100 washings to the color of a pale summer sky. It smelled faintly of lye soap and sunshine. Elara looked at it, then at him. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod toward a corner of the main room, where a length of rope had been strung up. A faded calico sheet draped over it. A simple laundry screen. A wall of privacy. She took the shirt. The fabric was cool and reassuring in her trembling hands. She walked behind the screen, her movements stiff. The heavy sweat and leather-scented duster slid from her shoulders, pooling on the floor. She dropped the other man's filthy wool coat on top of it. A small, grim burial. For a long moment, she just stood, breathing in the quiet air of the small house. Then, she pulled the chambray shirt on over her head. It fell to her mid-thigh, the sleeves hanging past her hands. The worn cotton felt like a balm against her chafed, abused skin. It was a shield far better than the duster. It was a kindness. As she rolled up the long sleeves, buttoning the front, she felt a subtle shift inside her. It was the first decision she had made for her own comfort, the first act of agency, in what felt like a lifetime. She was covered. She was, in this small, borrowed way, reclaiming the lines of her own body. When she stepped out, Boone was back at the kitchen table. He had taken a small, sharp paring knife from a wooden block and was methodically peeling a potato, the skin falling away in a single, long curl. He didn't look up immediately, giving her a moment to settle. She sat in the chair she had occupied before. He finished one potato and started on another. The blade worked with practiced efficiency. Then he stopped. He set the potato down and balanced the knife on his forefinger, watching the way the dim light caught the sharpened steel edge. The glint was cold, precise. It reminded him of all the times a man was forced to choose his tools. The heavy Colt revolver hanging on the peg by the door was a tool for endings. It was loud, final, and ripped holes in the world that could not be mended. A knife, he thought, was different. A knife could peel a potato for supper. It could cut a rope. It could be a threat, held in reserve. That didn't need to shatter the peace of a valley to make its point. The gun belt on the wall was a fact of his life, but his gaze on the small, spinning blade was a testament to the harder choices the many, many times he had consciously chosen not to reach for the gun. He set the knife down. "Burke Talon," Elara said, and the name dropped into the quiet room like a stone. Boone picked up the potato and his knife, resuming his work. "Your stepfather." It wasn't a question. "He's a fool when he drinks, and he's always drinking." Her voice was low, devoid of emotion, as if she were reciting a list of supplies. "He gambles at the shack by the wash, always losing, always owing." The knife paused. "Who did he owe?" "A man named Orrin Pike. He runs horses and other things out of the Mesquite Divide." Boone's knuckles whitened slightly on the knife handle. Orrin Pike. The name was known. Pike didn't just trade in horses, he traded in leverage, in fear, and in people who had no one to stand for them. "Burke," she continued, her eyes fixed on the tabletop. He ran out of money. He ran out of credit, so he offered something else. The shame was a hot coal in her throat, but she forced the words out. He signed what he called a service indenture to pay his debt. He said I would work for Mr. Pike at his tavern. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting Boone's. They were dry and fierce. It was a sham. I saw the paper when Pike's men came. It wasn't an indenture. It was a bill of sale, like for a mare, with my name on it. Boone set the knife down again, this time for good. He pushed the bowl of peeled potatoes aside. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the victim who had collapsed on his porch, but the woman sitting straight-backed in his chair, wearing his shirt, her dignity a battered, defiant thing. He had seen this kind of trouble before. It came with the territory, like drought or rattlesnakes. It was a problem that could be solved in several ways. He could ride her clear to the next county. He could face it down. He let the silence stretch, giving her ordeal the respect of his full consideration. Finally, he asked the only question that mattered. Do you want me to take you somewhere, or do you want to make a stand? Elara blinked, the directness of the question surprising her. Take me where? I can get you to the stage line in Calico Bend by tomorrow night, he said, his voice flat and practical. You could be in another territory by the end of the week. Pike's reach is long, but it's not that long. She turned her head to look out the small, clean window beside the table. The only thing moving in the vast, parched landscape was the windmill over the well. It turned with a slow, rhythmic, metallic groan, a sound of labor and persistence. Scree, caw, scree, caw. It fought the dry wind, a constant battle just to draw water, just to exist. It was the ranch's heartbeat. She watched its blade slice through the air, turning and turning, never stopping, running. He was offering her a way to run. It was a sensible offer, a kind one. She had been running when she burst out of that shack, but the thought of getting on that stagecoach, of looking over her shoulder in every new town, of waiting for the day when Burke's debts or Pike's memory caught up with her, it was a different kind of prison. If I run now, she said, her voice quiet but gaining a new, hard resonance, I'll be running for the rest of my life. Burke will find another game. Orrin Pike will find another girl. She turned back to face him. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but something else was growing beside it, a weary, stubborn anger. I want to stand, she said. I'm tired of running out of fear. Boone Ashford held her gaze for a long time. A flicker of something respect, or perhaps just recognition passed through his gray eyes. He gave a single, curt nod. It was done. The decision was made. The alliance was formed. Without another word, he stood up, took the bowl of potatoes to the stove, and began preparing their meal. He stirred a pot of bean stew that had been simmering on the back of the stove, the aroma of smoked bacon and chili filling the kitchen. He mixed a quick batter for cornbread and poured it into a sizzling, greased cast-iron skillet. They ate at the table as the sun began to dip, painting the small kitchen in long shadows and stripes of amber light. The food was simple, hearty, and honest. They ate without speaking, but the silence was no longer the awkward, assessing quiet of strangers. It was a different quality of silence altogether. It was the warm, settled quiet of two people who had reached a grave understanding, a silence anchored by the shared, simple comfort of hot food and a sealed pact. When the meal was over, Elara stood to clear the plates, but Boone waved her back down. I'll see to it. As dusk bled into true night, he lit the single oil lamp on the table, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. He walked to a large, plain wooden chest in the corner of the main room and lifted the lid. Elara watched, assuming he was getting a blanket for himself, perhaps to sleep on the porch. He pulled out 2 thick wool blankets and a clean pillow, but instead of heading to the door, he walked to the worn settee against the far wall. He began to methodically lay out the blankets, making a bed. You'll take the bed, he said, not looking at her. It was a statement of fact. Alara stood immediately. "I can't. That's your room. I'll take the couch." "No," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. He tucked the edge of the blanket in. "The bedroom has a door, and the door has a lock." He didn't need to say more. He wasn't just offering her comfort. He was offering her security. He was drawing a line of profound respect, giving her the only truly private, defensible space in his home. She found she had no words to argue. Later, she lay in the narrow bed, the door firmly latched. The room was sparse, containing only the bed, a small table, and a wooden crate for storage. It smelled of sun-dried linens and old, clean wood. She lay staring into the darkness, her body aching and exhausted, but her mind relentlessly, painfully alert. She began to map the house, charting the geography of her new, temporary fortress. "The door is latched, solid wood. From this bed, 10 steps to the main room. I saw the gun cabinet by the door, locked. 7 steps from the front door to the kitchen. 3 steps from the kitchen table to the back door." She was building an architecture of safety in her mind, measuring distances, noting obstacles. It was the cautious calculus of a person who had learned that safety was not a guarantee, but a strategy. As he'd pulled the blankets from the chest, Boone's hand had brushed a small tin box tucked in the bottom. He'd frozen for a second, the familiar ache tightening his chest. Inside it, he knew, was a letter. The papers soft and brittle from being folded and unfolded countless times. "My dearest Sarah," the faded ink read, a letter he'd written in a daze of grief a week after the fever took his wife. 3 years gone. A letter full of all the words he hadn't said. A letter he could never send because there was no one left to receive it. He'd closed the chest, the brief, sharp memory settling back into the quiet solitude he'd built around himself. It was the reason he lived with so few words. The person he'd shared most of them with was gone. Hours later, Alara was jolted from a light, uneasy doze by a sound, a tiny, skittering scratch from inside the wall. Her heart leaped into her throat. She sat bolt upright, every nerve screaming, "Pike! They'd found her!" Then, a different sound. The rasp of a match striking sulfur. A thin line of yellow light appeared under her door, followed by the soft sound of a boot on the floorboards. The front door creaked open, then shut. She slid from the bed, bare feet silent on the cool floor. She crept to the room's small window, which faced the porch. Through the glass, she saw that he had lit the oil lamp and placed it on the porch railing. And in the chair, the same one he'd been in when she first saw him, sat Boone Ashford. His back was to her. He wasn't holding a rifle. His gun belt was still on its peg. He was just sitting, his hat on, his elbows on his knees, staring out into the impenetrable darkness of the open ranch land. He was guarding the wind, guarding the night. Alara watched him, her breath fogging the glass. That solitary figure, a shield of stillness against the vast, unknown dark, looked as solid and immovable as a newly set fence post. He was a wall, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt something loosen in her chest. She went back to the bed, and this time, she slept. The first hint of gray dawn woke her. The house was cold and still. She dressed quickly in the chambray shirt and her own salvaged skirt. In the main room, Boone was asleep on the settee, one arm hanging off the side, his breathing deep and even. He looked younger in sleep. The lines of caution on his face softened. A sudden, sharp need to be useful, to not be a guest or a burden, overwhelmed her. She saw the 2 empty water buckets by the door. Quietly, she unlatched the front door and slipped out. The morning air was so cold it stung her lungs, but it was clean. She made her way to the well, the groaning windmill her only companion. She found the wooden yoke and settled it over her shoulders, attaching the buckets. The hand pump was stiff and loud in the morning quiet, and it took all her weight to draw the water up. She filled one bucket, then the other, the weight settling heavily on her. She walked back slowly, her bare feet pressing into the cold, dusty ground. Halfway to the house, she stopped, her shoulders burning. The sun was just beginning to crest the jagged line of Kestrel Bluff, flooding the valley with a weak, hopeful light. She looked down at the water in the buckets, sloshing slightly. It was clear and precious. She tilted the yoke, pouring a small stream of water onto the cracked, thirsty earth. It vanished instantly, leaving only a dark, wet stain. She watched it, then straightened, settling the yoke more firmly on her shoulders. She was not spilled water. She was not a debt to be paid or a thing to be bartered. No one else would write the rest of her life. She would hold the pen. She took a deep breath and walked the rest of the way to the house. They came just after the sun had burned the last of the morning chill from the air. Ilara had been in the small, dry earth yard, shaking out the blankets Boone had used on the settee. When she heard the sound, it wasn't the sound of a single, purposeful rider. It was the lazy, arrogant percussion of multiple horses, moving at a walk, their hooves striking the hard pan with a confidence that claimed the land they crossed. Boone stepped out onto the porch, drying his hands on a scrap of toweling. He didn't reach for the gunbelt on its peg. He just stood and watched the head of the wash, his body still but his eyes alert. A column of ochre dust rose against the pale sky, resolving itself into 3 figures. They rode abreast, as if they owned the valley, their pace deliberately slow, a predator's inspection. The man in the middle was Orrin Pike. He was a broad, heavy man, his weight pressing his big gelding into the earth. He wore a dark wool vest, even in the growing heat, a silver concho glinting on his hatband, and a look of absolute, bovine certainty. To his left was a thin, scarred man who looked like he'd been carved from bad wood. To his right, a younger man, barely 20, trying to wear the same sneer as his companions, but his eyes kept darting to the house, to the shadows, to the windmill. They reined in about 30 feet from the porch. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the creak, caw, creak, caw of Boone's windmill. Orrin Pike spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Then he laughed. It was a hollow, grating sound, utterly devoid of humor. It was a noise meant to fill the air, to assert dominance. "Ashford," Pike boomed, his voice as thick as his frame. He gestured with a riding glove toward the house, not even looking at Boone directly, but at the door where Ilara had vanished. "I'm here for my property. The debt is past due, and I'm collecting the collateral." Boone Ashford stood on the top step of the porch. The slight elevation put his eyeline level with Pike's, though Pike was mounted. His hands were loose at his sides, the right one hanging a good 2 feet from the revolver on the wall peg. His voice, when it came, was as flat and still as the surface of a reservoir at dawn. "We don't pawn people here." "Pike." It was not an argument. It was not a plea. It was a statement of law, a different law from the one Pike was used to. Pike's smile tightened. "That's fine talk from a man hiding what ain't his. You send her out, or we come in and get her. Your choice, rancher." "It's not his choice." The voice was Ilara's. She stepped through the doorway, letting the screen door slap shut behind her. She had been working before they arrived, helping Boone clear stones from the small patch he'd marked for a garden. The chambray shirt was too large, so she had tied the tails high at her waist, and the sleeves were rolled to her elbows. Her hair was pulled back, and her face, though pale, was set. She walked past the peg holding the gunbelt and stood on the porch, not behind Boone, but beside him. Her eyes were fixed, not on the ground, not on the horizon, but straight on Orrin Pike. She was no longer the creature that had collapsed in the shade. She was a resident. Pike's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine surprise, before narrowing into an appreciative, ugly leer. "Well, look at that. All cleaned up. You'll fetch a fine price at the mesquite. Jed, remind Mr. Ashford here what happens when a man interferes with another man's business." The scarred man on Pike's left, Jed, moved. He didn't go for a fast draw. This wasn't a duel. It was an execution of an order, a test of nerve. He deliberately unhooked the leather thong from his revolver's hammer and wrapped his scarred fingers around the grip. He was trying to make Boone flinch. to make him reach for the gunbelt on the wall, to give them the excuse they needed. "I wouldn't," Boone said, his voice still perfectly level. Jed's lips peeled back in a grin of broken teeth. "You ain't armed, old man." He drew the gun, lifting the barrel. Boone moved. It was not the fast, frantic motion of a barroom brawler. It was the precise, economical, and devastating application of physics, born of cavalry training. He was on the porch, a foot higher than the man on the horse. As Jed raised the gun, Boone took one half step down and forward, moving inside the arc of the horse's head. He didn't reach for the gun or the hand. He used his leg. In one smooth, upward pivot, he kicked. His boot heel struck the underside of the revolver's long barrel. There was a sharp, wet crack as the metal barrel, driven upward by the force of the kick, slammed into the thick, sun-baked pine of the porch post. The impact sent a shock of pain up Jed's arm and knocked the gun from his grasp. A single shot discharged from the impact, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the thick wood of the post, inches from where Alara had been standing. The revolver clattered to the dirt. Jed cursed, clutching his stinging, numbed hand, his face a mask of shock and fury. The entire event had taken less than 2 seconds. Boone was already stepping back up onto the porch, his hands once again empty at his sides. He had disarmed the man, humiliated him, and proven his point without shedding a single drop of blood. The young rider on Pike's right flinched, his hand moving toward his own weapon, but Pike's voice stopped him. "Hold." Amos Pike's face was now a dark, mottled red. The pretense of civility was gone. "You're a quick man with your boots, Ashford, but you can't kick a court order." He turned in his saddle. "Mr. Finch, show him the paper." Alara hadn't noticed the fourth man. He had been riding slightly behind Pike, on a tired-looking mule, almost hidden. He was a small man in a sweat-stained suit coat and a derby hat. He held a leather satchel in his lap as if it were a shield. He looked ill. "This is Deputy Registrar Hezekiah Finch." Pike sneered. "He's here on behalf of the county, to certify the seizure. Mr. Finch dismounted, his legs trembling slightly. He pulled a folded document from his satchel, his fingers fumbling with the paper. "Sir," Finch stammered, looking at Boone's chest rather than his eyes. I have here a duly recorded note of debt, signed by one Burke Talon. The debt is owed to Mr. Orrin Pike. Here, the terms of non-payment specify the forfeiture of collateral, and that collateral is me." Alara said. It was not a question. "Mr." Finch winced. "Well, that is the understanding." "Read the paper." "Mr. Finch," Alara demanded. Her voice cut through the stammering, sharp and cold as a razor. "Read it out loud. All of it." Pike shot her a look of pure venom. "The girl doesn't make demands. She does on my property," Boone interrupted, his voice finally taking on a hard edge. "Read it." As the lady asked, trapped between Pike's fury and Boone's unyielding calm. "Mr." Finch swallowed. He unfolded the paper, which trembled in his grip. He began to read, his voice thin and reedy. "I, Burke Talon, this 15th day of August, 1873, in consideration for the sum of $100, cash in hand, do pledge as security for the repayment of said sum, 1 bay mare, branded double diamond, 1 freight wagon, patent axles, and—" Finch stopped. His eyes scanned the rest of the document frantically. "And what?" Alara pressed, taking a step forward. "What else does it say I'm worth?" "Mr. Finch, it says, and all proceeds from my winter trapping line, payable at the end of the season." Finch finished, his voice dropping to a miserable whisper. A profound, heavy silence fell over the yard, broken only by Jed's quiet cursing and the groan of the windmill. Pike's face had gone from red to a pale, waxy white. He was staring at the paper in Finch's hand with disbelief. He had brought the wrong document. He had brought Talon's simple, legal debt note for the mare and wagon, not the fabricated, illegal bill of sale for Alara. My name is Elara Vance, she said, her voice ringing in the still air. Is my name? Elara Vance. Written on that document as collateral Mr. Finch looked at the paper one last time, as if praying the words would change. No, ma'am, it is not. Then you are on my land under false pretenses. Mr. Pike, Boone said, right on cue, as if summoned by some higher sense of justice. A new sound emerged, the jingle of a harness and the rattle of buggy wheels. Coming down the faint track that led to the main road was Silas Croft, the mail carrier. He was a wiry man who minded his own business, but he was also a federal employee and a notorious gossip. He pulled his buggy to a halt, his eyes wide, taking in the scene: Pike and his men, the gun in the dust, the pale deputy, and the man and woman standing firm on the porch. Boone Ashford seized the moment. He turned, stepped inside the house for less than 10 seconds, and returned with a pencil and a blank page torn from his own ranch ledger. He held them out to Mr. Finch, Mr. Finch, as a public official. I require you to write a statement, Boone said, his voice carrying clearly to the mail carrier. I need you to write that you came to the Dry Lantern Ranch today, in the company of Mr. Orrin Pike, to execute a seizure based on this document. He tapped the paper Finch was still holding. And I need you to state that the party Mr. Pike sought to seize, Miss Elara Vance, was not named on said document. Now see here, Pike began, but Boone ignored him. It's a simple record of your official duties, Mr. Finch, Boone said calmly. You have a witness. He nodded toward Silas, who was watching with avid interest. Finch was trapped. To refuse would be to admit his complicity in Pike's fraud, right in front of a federal witness. To sign was to create a legal record of Pike's failure. He looked at Pike, who was vibrating with a murderous, silent rage. Pike could do nothing. To harm a county registrar in front of the mailman was an act he couldn't walk away from. With a hand that shook so badly he could barely form the letters, Hezekiah Finch took the ledger paper and pencil. Leaning against the porch post, the same one splintered by Jed's bullet, he wrote. His signature was a jagged, terrified scrawl. Boone took the paper and held it out to the mail carrier. Mr. Croft, would you be so kind as to witness that Mr. Finch signed this on my property? This date, Silas, delighted to be part of the drama, hopped down and affixed his own, much cleaner signature. Boone folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Thank you, gentlemen. That concludes our business. Orrin Pike gathered his reins, his knuckles white. His eyes were no longer on Boone. They were on Elara, and the look in them was a promise of a different kind of retribution. This ain't finished. Rancher, Pike spat, his voice low and dangerous. This paper trick won't save you. I'll be back tomorrow, with a proper warrant from a judge who understands my business, and I will collect what I am owed. He yanked his horse's head around, kicked its flanks, and thundered out of the yard, his 2 men scrambling after him. Jed, in his haste, didn't even stop to retrieve his gun from the dust. Boone Ashford watched them go, the pillar of dust marking their angry retreat. The immense tension that had gripped the yard snapped. Elara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, her legs suddenly weak, and she leaned against the post. Boone walked over to his own horse, hitched to the rail. The rein had been knocked loose during the confrontation. He picked it up, his movements calm and deliberate, and began to retie the leather strap with a simple, secure knot. Elara watched his hands, strong, steady, capable. He wasn't shaking. He finished the knot and stroked the horse's neck. We'll have business in town tomorrow, he said quietly, as if commenting on the weather. She looked at him, and then at the splintered mark on the post where the bullet had gone, the small, dark hole that represented a line crossed. A slow, small, tired smile touched one corner of her mouth. It was not a smile of victory. It was the smile of a partnership forged in fire. They had stood their ground, together. That night, the house was locked and barred. The rifle was off Boone's wall and leaning by his settee. They ate their meal of beans and cornbread in near silence, the echo of the confrontation still hanging in the air. Afterward, Elara sat by the cold stove, soaking her foot in a basin of hot water and salt. The cut on her heel from her escape had reopened during the day, and it was throbbing. Boone entered from the small pantry, holding a small tin of dark salve. He knelt in front of her. Alara instinctively pulled her foot from the water. "It's just horse liniment," he said, his voice quiet. "It'll draw the soreness and keep it from turning bad." She hesitated. He was kneeling, his head bowed as he opened the tin. He was not looking at her with possession, like Pike, or with fear, like Finch. He was looking at her injury. Slowly, she lifted her foot from the basin. He took a clean rag, dried her foot and heel gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly deft. He scooped a small amount of the sharp-smelling salve onto his finger. His touch was clinical, firm, and focused only on the cut. He worked the salve in, his thumb rubbing small circles, easing the tension from the bruised muscle. He did not touch her ankle, or her leg. He did not overstep the boundary of her consent by an inch. The contact was brief, medical, and yet more profoundly intimate than any she had ever known. It was an act of mending. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, finished, and stood up. "Keep it dry." He left the tin on the table and went to his set good on the settee, leaving her alone with the warmth of the stove and the clean, sharp scent of the salve. The ride to Calico Bend was tense, the miles spooling out under a sky that offered no reprieve. They rode Boone's two sturdiest horses, leaving the mule to rest. Boone had his rifle scabbarded by his knee, and the Colt revolver now sat heavy on his hip. But his posture was that of a rancher, not a gunfighter. He rode with his eyes on the horizon, cataloging every dust devil and distant rider, while Alara's attention was fixed inward. She was calculating, replaying every moment of her life under Burke's roof, searching for a weapon. Calico Bend was not a city, but it was the center of their small, sun-scorched universe. It was a single, wide street cut through the alkali flats, lined with two-story wooden facades, a livery, a mercantile, the marshal's office, and two saloons that seemed to be in constant competition. As they rode down the main thoroughfare, the quiet of the ranch was replaced by the clatter of wagon wheels, the ring of a distant blacksmith's anvil, and the low hum of commerce. Their first stop was not the marshal. It was a small, dusty storefront tucked between the feed store and the assayer's office, Quayle's Printing Gazette. The bell above the door jangled, a tinny, nervous sound. The shop smelled powerfully of ink, chemical solvents, and old paper. A large, complex flatbed press dominated the back of the room, currently silent. In the front, a man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually worried expression looked up over his spectacles. This was Luther Quayle. "Mr. Ashford, ma'am." He wiped his hands on an apron that was already black with ink. "What can I do for you? Business cards, a bill of lading." "Just looking for some paper." "Mr. Quayle," Boone said, his voice easy. He let his gaze drift over the stacks of paper, the cases of lead type, the array of official-looking stamps and seals on the desk. Alara stepped forward, her eyes scanning the counter. She saw a stack of freshly printed auction notices, and then, beside them, a heavy, cast-iron notary seal. She looked at it, her memory flashing. She remembered the day Burke had come home, drunk and triumphant, waving the first loan agreement from Pike. And she remembered the day, 2 weeks later, when Pike's men had come to the shack while Burke was gone, carrying the other document, the one they'd briefly flashed before her, the one that wasn't a loan, but a sale. "Mr. Quayle," she said, her voice steady. "You do a lot of legal forms for Mr. Pike, don't you?" Luther Quayle's meager courage evaporated. He visibly paled, the ink on his fingers standing out against his white knuckles. I do work for many businessmen, ma'am. Mr. Pike, Mr. Ashford. All are welcome customers." "Of course," Boone said, stepping in smoothly. He pointed to a high stack of paper in the corner, marred by ink blotches and alignment errors. "I'm in need of some cheap scrap for starting fires, figuring ledgers. What would you take for that stack of misprints?" Quayle looked relieved to be discussing a simple transaction. "Oh, that's just refuse. Mr. Ashford, 2 bits, and it's yours." Appreciate it, Boone said. He glanced at the desk. And I'll take a box of that new carbon transfer paper, if you have it, for my ranch accounts. Right away. As Quayle turned to wrap the carbon paper, Alara leaned toward Boone and whispered, her voice barely a breath. The paper Pike's men had. The one he didn't bring yesterday. It had a notary seal. It looked official, but it was flawed. Boone kept his face impassive. How the eagle. On the stamp. The left wing was bent, lower than the right. It looked broken. Boone nodded, his eyes flicking to the pristine notary seal on Quayle's desk. It was perfect. Pike had his own, flawed stamp. And Quayle, his printer, either had it or made it for him. Boone paid for the paper, bundled the heavy stack of misprints under his arm, and they left. Outside, Alara asked. Why the scrap paper? Boone held up a single misprinted sheet against the sunlight. Every batch of paper has a watermark, or a specific fiber. Pike's forged document will have come from Quayle. This, he said, tapping the stack, is our baseline. We can prove Pike's paper came from the same stock as Quayle's. They needed to see the marshal. But first, they needed food. And they needed to gauge the town. The mail carrier, Silas Croft, had clearly spread the tale. They walked toward the Calico Nugget, the town's main saloon. The moment they pushed through the Batwing doors, the low roar of conversation died. Every man at the bar, every gambler at the tables, turned to look. They stared at Boone, a man known for his solitude, and then their eyes settled on Alara, hungry and speculative. That's her, a man whispered from the bar. The debt girl Pike's after. Don't look like much, another muttered. Ashford's trading up. Izzy Alara felt the blood rush to her face. She felt the old, familiar instinct to shrink, to lower her head, to become invisible. But she thought of the groaning windmill, of the locked bedroom door, of the man standing beside her who had kicked a gun out of another man's hand rather than draw his own. She squared her shoulders. She ignored the whispers and the stares. She walked past the bar, through the cloud of smoke, and out the back door, where several freighters and ranchers were noisily arguing over the tangle of horses at the hitching post. This blasted mule of yours is tied right over my gelding. Well, I can't get to him, can I? The post was a mess of reins, lead ropes, and agitated animals. Alara put down the small bundle of supplies she'd bought at the mercantile. She walked straight into the knot of men. Excuse me, she said, her voice clear. They paused, surprised. What you want? Girlie, your horses are tangled. You're pulling on the wrong lines. You, she said, pointing to the first man, are pulling on his horse's bit. You're just making him panic. She ducked under a horse's neck, deftly unhooked one rein, passed it under another, and handed it to the owner. There, she moved to the next one, her hands quick and sure, untying and retying, her voice low and calming to the animals. The men watched, dumbfounded. In 2 minutes, the entire line was orderly. A freighter, impressed, fished in his pocket and tossed her a coin. Well, I'll be, thanks. Miss, Alara caught the nickel. She didn't smile. She just nodded. My pleasure. Boone had watched the entire scene from the saloon doorway. He hadn't interfered. He had let her claim her own space. When she walked back in, coin in hand, the whispers had not entirely stopped, but their character had changed. She had not acted like a victim. She had worked. She had earned. She had faced them down without a weapon. They left the saloon and crossed the dusty street to the one-story adobe building with a simple sign, Town Marshal, Ada Graves. The office was small, orderly, and smelled of strong coffee and gun oil. A woman sat behind a large oak desk, her back to a wall covered with wanted posters. She was perhaps 60, with a face like a dried apple, and a thick braid of hair as white as alkali salt. She looked up as they entered, her eyes a sharp, intelligent blue. Boone, she said, her voice a dry rasp. It was a greeting, not a question. Ada, he replied, the corners of his mouth lifting in a rare, thin smile. He set the stack of misprinted paper on the floor. It's been a while. Not since the Pecos campaign, she said. You looked worse then. What trouble are you in now? Not mine. Entirely. He nodded at Alara. This is Miss Alara Vance. She's got a problem with Orrin Pike. Ada's eyes assessed Alara. It was not a judgmental look. It was a weighing of facts. Pike is a problem for the whole county. Sit. As Alara recounted the story, the debt, the shack, the false paper, the confrontation, Ada listened without interruption. She made a few notes on a blotter. When Alara finished, Ada tapped her pencil. Pike was already here, an hour ago. Had that worthless bootlick Finch with him. Left this? She slid a document across the desk. It was a new warrant, hastily drawn up. He's smarter than I thought, Ada said, her lip curling. He's not trying to seize her. He's filing a charge against you, Boone, interference with a lawful debt collection. He's asking for a warrant for your arrest, and for the court to seize the disputed property. That's Miss Vance's evidence, pending a hearing. Boone's hand instinctively went to the gun on his hip. Don't, Ada said sharply. It's a bluff, and a bad one. She jabbed the paper with her finger. Look, he filed it in the Mesquite Divide district, citing his own friendly judge. But this ranch and this town are in Calico jurisdiction. His judge's paper doesn't run here. Second, she pointed again. There's no circuit judge countersignature. There's no docket number assigned. This isn't a warrant. It's an application. And as the ranking law in this jurisdiction, I'm denying it. She picked up a stamp, inked it, and slammed it down on the paper. Denied. A. Graves. Town Marshal. That solves today, Ada said, handing the paper back to Boone. It won't solve tomorrow. Pike's a bully, but he's a rich bully. He will find a way to make this legal or legal-looking. That fraudulent bill of sale exists, even if he was fool enough to bring the wrong paper yesterday. Then we have to prove the bill of sale itself is a fraud, Boone said. Exactly. Ada leaned forward. The 13th Amendment and the Peonage Act of '67 make this kind of indenturement illegal. You can't sell a person to pay a debt, but Pike will claim she was a runaway apprentice, or that she signed a labor contract. What we need is proof of conspiracy to commit fraud. We need to prove he and Burke Talon knew they were engaging in an illegal transaction. That's a high bar. Boone. Boone nodded, his face grim. He understood. This was his preferred battlefield. A bullet would kill Pike, but it would make Alara a fugitive and him a murderer. The law, if they could wield it, would kill Pike's right to her. It was the only way to win for good. He looked at Alara. She had been listening, her brow furrowed. Now, her eyes lit with a sudden, sharp memory. The ledgers, she said. Ada raised an eyebrow. What ledgers, Burke? My stepfather. He was a cheat. He cheated at cards. He cheated on his trapping lines. He cheated everyone. And he was proud of it. He kept 2 sets of books. Boone looked at her, understanding dawning. One for the taxman, one for everyone, Alara said, her voice gaining speed. And one for himself. A private ledger, where he wrote down every crooked deal, every IOU, every secret. He called it his true book. He said it was to make sure his partners in crime never cheated him. I know where he kept it. In his old storage shack, by the abandoned mine, under a loose floorboard. Ada Graves allowed herself a small, cold smile. That, she said, is what we call proof of fraudulent intent. The storage shack was miles away, closer to the Badlands. They rode fast, Boone's stack of misprints and his box of carbon paper in his saddlebag. The shack was derelict, smelling of rust, old pelts, and rat droppings. Here, Alara said, pointing to a corner beneath a stack of broken traps. Boone cleared the debris. A single floorboard was cut shorter than the others. He pried it up with his knife. Beneath it was a dust-covered, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were 2 ledgers. The first was thin, labeled Accounts, 1873. It was sparse, listing sales of beaver pelts and supplies purchased. The second was thick, bound in cracked leather. The front was unlabeled. Boone opened it. The pages were crammed with Burke's spidery, self-important script. It was a meticulous record of his vices. And there, on a page dated 3 months ago, they found it. A heading Act O. Pike. There were several entries. Cash for losses, $40. Wagon and mare see formal note, $60. And then The final, damning line, balance due, $100. Collateral 1 living asset E-V. Transfer on demand. Boone let out a slow breath. This was the smoking gun. It proved Burke and Pike had entered into a specific, illegal contract to trade a human being. "We can't take the book," Boone said. "That's theft. Ada can't use it if we steal it." "Then what?" Alara asked, her voice desperate. Boone pulled the box of carbon transfer paper and a clean sheet from the misprint stack from his saddlebag. He spread the clean sheet on the floor. He placed the black carbon paper on top of it. Then, very carefully, he laid the ledger open, lining up the incriminating entry over the carbon paper. "This is how they transfer shipping stencils," he said. He took a silver dollar from his pocket. Using the coin's smooth, hard edge, he rubbed firmly and methodically over the page, back and forth, pressing the script from the ledger above, through the carbon, onto the clean sheet below. It was a perfect, precise impression. He lifted the ledger. There, on the fresh paper, was a dark, clear, undeniable copy of Burke's own handwriting. Collateral 1 living asset EV. They rode back to Calico Bend as the sun set, the sky turning a bruised purple. They handed the carbon copy to Ada. She held it up to the lamp, comparing the fiber of the paper to the scrap stack Boone had brought. Same paper stock, same watermark. And Burke's own hand. She nodded, satisfied. "This is our weapon." "So what now?" Boone asked. "Do you arrest him?" "Not yet," Ada said. "Pike's got money. He'll buy a judge. We need a judge he can't buy. And we need a jury he can't intimidate." She walked to the calendar on her wall. "The circuit judge, Judge Elias Thorne, will be here for the full moon. At the end of the harvest, the town will be full of farmers and ranchers, men who don't like Pike any more than we do. We're going to hold a public hearing. In the town hall." She turned to Alara. "Pike's lawyers will try to paint you as a liar, a harlot, or a fool. This piece of paper," she tapped the carbon copy, "is our evidence. But you are our witness." She pushed a clean sheet of paper, a pen, and an inkwell across her desk toward Alara. "Write it down. Everything you told me, from the beginning. Don't write what you were afraid of. Write what happened. Write what you saw. Write the truth." Alara sat down at the marshal's desk. The office was quiet, save for the ticking of the clock. She picked up the pen. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The ink blotched on her first attempt. She took a deep breath, picturing the groaning windmill, picturing Boone's steady hands tying a knot, picturing the coin in her palm. She set the pen to the paper again. Her hand was still trembling, but the letters she formed were clear, and sharp, and angry. "My name is Alara Vance," as she wrote. The shaking began to subside. She was no longer a piece of collateral. She was no longer a rumor in a saloon. She was, for the first time in her life, the author of her own story. Outside, a strong, cool wind began to blow down from Kestrel Bluff, sweeping the dust from the streets and rattling the windows of the town. The air was clear and sharp. The stage was being set. The days leading up to the hearing at the end of the harvest fell into a rhythm dictated not by fear, but by the endless, honest work of the ranch. The dry lantern was a harsh mistress, demanding sweat and attention from sunup to sundown. And in that labor, Alara found a strange sort of peace. The future was an unknown, a courtroom showdown that loomed like a thunderhead on the horizon. But the present was real. It was the weight of a water bucket, the smell of hot leather, the solid presence of the man working beside her. One afternoon, Boone was mending a section of corral fence where a post had rotted through. He had a length of thick hemp rope he needed to lash to a new post. He showed Alara the knot. "It's a clove hitch," he said, his voice a low, patient rumble against the vast quiet of the plains. He looped the rope around the post, his large, calloused hands moving with an unhurried, practiced grace. "Pass the end under, then over, then tuck it through. It holds tighter the more you pull on it. Useful." He handed her the rope. "You try." Her fingers, still clumsy with the unfamiliar work, fumbled with the thick rope. She tried to mimic his movements, but the loop slipped, the end going the wrong way. A flush of frustration crept up her neck. Under Burke's roof, a mistake meant a curse. Sometimes a blow. She braced for a sharp word. "No, not like that," Boone said, his voice unchanged. He didn't snatch the rope from her. He simply reached out, his hand hovering near hers. "Here, take this end. Now bring it around the back. Yes, now through the loop you just made. Pull it snug." She did as he said. The knot formed, neat and secure. She pulled on it, and as he'd said, it tightened, gripping the post like a vice. A small, unfamiliar spark of pride flickered inside her. She had learned something new, something useful. She spent the next day working in the long, low stable. One of the stall doors was hanging crooked, its leather hinges stretched and cracked. She found a scrap of thick hide in the tack room and, using Boone's sharp awl and a length of waxed thread, she began to repair it. The work was slow and meticulous. As she stitched, a tune surfaced from some deep, forgotten well of memory. It was a simple, rambling melody, a song her mother used to hum while shelling peas on the porch. Without thinking, she began to hum it herself. The sound was small and thin in the airy space of the barn, almost lost amidst the soft shuffling of the horses and the buzz of flies. But it was there, a thread of music in a place that had only known the sounds of wind and work. It was the first time in years she had made a sound for no reason other than the quiet contentment of the moment. The silence of the Dry Lantern Ranch was no longer empty. She was beginning to fill it. The following morning, Boone led his best horse out of the stable. It was a handsome sorrel with a white blaze and intelligent eyes. "This is Marrow," he said, stroking the horse's neck. "He's got a good mouth and a steady heart. It's time you learn to ride properly, not like you're stealing him." He showed her how to saddle the horse, how to check the cinch, how to hold the reins without pulling too hard. He gave her a leg up, and she settled into the worn leather seat, feeling impossibly high off the ground. "Just walk him first," Boone said, leading the horse in a slow circle. "Feel his rhythm. He'll listen to your hands, but he'll listen more to your legs and your balance. You're a team, not a master and a servant." She spent an hour just walking, circling the corral, her body slowly learning the gentle sway of the horse's gait. She was tense at first, her shoulders hunched, her hands gripping the reins too tightly. "Breathe," Boone's voice instructed from the center of the ring. "Let your shoulders drop. Trust him." She took a breath, and another. She loosened her grip. Marrow's ears flickered, and he let out a soft snort, his pace evening out. She felt the powerful muscles moving beneath her, a living engine of strength and grace. Boone opened the corral gate. "Take him out to the flats. Let him trot, out in the open, with the vast, empty land stretching away on all sides." A sense of exhilaration began to bubble up inside her. She nudged Marrow with her heels as Boone had shown her. The horse broke into a smooth, easy trot. The jarring motion surprised her, but she found her balance, rising and falling with the rhythm. "Good," Boone called, watching from the gate. "Now, a little more." She urged Marrow on, and the trot lengthened into a canter. The world, which had been a series of threats and cages, suddenly opened up. The wind, which had once been a searing, dust-filled enemy, was now cool and clean against her face. It whipped a strand of hair loose from her braid and flung it across her cheek. The steady, three-beat rhythm of the canter was like a heartbeat, strong and alive, and for the first time since she was a small child. Alara Vance threw her head back and laughed. The sound was a shock, even to her. It was loud and clear and utterly unburdened. It was the sound of a joy so pure and unexpected it felt like breaking the surface of the water after being held under for too long. It was the sound of freedom. That evening, they ate a meal of baked squash stuffed with corn and beans. The small kitchen was filled with a comfortable warmth. After they finished, Boone took their plates to the wash basin. Alara stood, picking up a drying cloth. He washed, and she dried. They moved around each other in the small space, a silent, unpracticed choreography. It wasn't graceful. Their elbows bumped once, and she had to step back to let him reach for the soap. It was a clumsy dance, but it was a dance for two. They were building a domestic rhythm, a partnership that extended beyond the crisis that had brought them together. The change in the weather came suddenly, as it often did in the high desert. The sky, which had been a clear, placid blue, turned a sickly, bruised yellow-gray on the western horizon. The wind stopped. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a strange, electric tension. The windmill groaned to a halt. "Dust storm," Boone said, his voice flat. He was already moving. Checking the latches on the doors. "It'll be a bad one." Ilara could hear it now. A low, distant roar, like a freight train where there were no tracks. The roar grew louder, and the yellow line on the horizon swelled, boiling up into a monstrous, rolling wall of dirt that blotted out the sun. "The south window," Boone said, pointing. "The latch is weak." They reached it at the same time. The wind hit the house with the force of a physical blow, a deafening shriek of air and sand. The old window frame rattled violently in its casing, the glass bowing inward. The weak latch popped open. "Hold it!" Boone yelled over the roar. He threw his shoulder against one side of the frame, his boots skidding on the floorboards as he braced himself. Ilara, without a second's hesitation, pressed her own back against the other side, adding her weight to his. The storm raged. The world outside the window vanished into a churning brown chaos. Sand and grit forced its way through the cracks, stinging their faces. They were back to back, a small, human brace against the full, impersonal fury of nature. His shoulder was a solid wall against her own. She could feel the strength in him, the unyielding resistance. In that moment, they weren't a man and a woman, a rescuer and a victim. They were simply two people holding a wall against the storm, partners in a desperate, immediate battle. The worst of it lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the roar began to recede. The pressure on the window lessened, and the shrieking wind dropped to a mournful howl. They held their positions for another minute, then another, until they were sure. Slowly, they straightened up, their muscles aching. The kitchen was coated in a fine layer of dust, but the window had held. The storm passed, and it was as if it had scoured the world clean. The air was cool and crisp, and the sky that night was a spectacle. With the dust washed from the atmosphere, the stars blazed with an impossible, ferocious intensity. They looked close enough to touch. They sat on the porch steps, wrapped in blankets, a tin cup of coffee warming Boone's hands. The silence was deep and profound. "When I was little," Ilara said, her voice soft, speaking to the darkness, "we lived in a house with a tin roof. On rainy nights, I'd lie awake and listen to the sound. It was like 1,000 tiny drums. My mother said it was the sky telling stories." She paused, her gaze lost in the sea of stars. "I haven't thought about that in years. It was a small memory, simple and unadorned. It was a piece of her past that had nothing to do with Burke, or debt, or fear. It was a memory of a time when the world had felt safe." Boone was quiet for a long time, watching the stars with her. Then he lifted his arm and pointed to a bright circlet of stars high overhead. "See that?" he said. "Folks from back east call it Corona Borealis, the northern crown. Out here, the old riders had a different name for it." "What did they call it?" she asked. "The crown of the rider." He said, "They said it was put there for a cowboy who got lost in a blizzard trying to save his herd. He froze to death, but they said the stars honored him, gave him a crown to wear for eternity. They used to say every man ought to find his own star in the sky, something to guide him when he's lost." Ilara looked from the glittering crown of stars back to the man beside her. The starlight softened the hard lines of his face, making him seem younger, more vulnerable. "What about you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What's your guiding star?" He didn't look at the sky. He turned his head and looked at her. His gray eyes, even in the dim light, were clear and steady. "I choose the person living beside me," he said, his voice low and even. When they won it, the words hung in the cold, clean air between them. It was not a declaration of ownership or a demand. It was an offering, a statement of allegiance, laid at her feet for her to pick up or to leave. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. In that moment, she felt a wave of something so powerful and unfamiliar it almost frightened her. It was a mix of gratitude and awe, and a deep, aching tenderness. Without thinking, driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she reached out and laid her hand on his forearm. The wool of his shirt was rough beneath her palm. Underneath it, his arm was hard as ironwood. It was the first time she had initiated contact. A tentative, questioning touch. She felt the muscle in his arm tense. A flicker of surprise, and then, just as quickly as she had reached out, the old fear, the old instinct for self-preservation, flared up. She pulled her hand back as if burned. The space between them crackled with the unspoken question. Boone didn't move. He didn't try to catch her hand or close the distance. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, a slow, gentle smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of infinite patience. "When you're ready," he said softly, "say so." He was giving her all the power, all the control. He was building a different kind of fence, not of wood and wire, but of respect and consent. A fence she could open whenever she chose. A soft, metallic tinkling drifted from the corner of the porch. Years ago, Boone's wife had tied a handful of old tin spoons to a string and hung them from the eaves. A makeshift wind chime. He'd never had the heart to take it down. The night breeze, clean and new after the storm, was making them sing. The small, random, gentle notes drifted out into the vast, silent dark, stitching the pieces of two broken hearts back together, one tiny, hopeful sound at a time. The night before the hearing was unnaturally still. The wind that had scoured the valley had died completely, and the silence that settled over the Dry Lantern Ranch was so profound it seemed to have weight. The moon was a sliver short of full, casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar landscape seem alien and foreboding. They had finished their meager supper, the plates washed and stacked, the small kitchen tidied with a meticulous care that was a quiet act of defiance against the chaos they knew was coming. Now they sat on the porch, not on the steps as they had after the dust storm, but in the two chairs, a small table between them holding the oil lamp. Its steady, golden flame was a tiny anchor in the vast, encroaching darkness. Ilara had her statement, the pages filled with her clear, steady script, folded in the pocket of the chambray shirt she now wore as if it were her own. She had read it aloud to Boone an hour earlier, her voice never wavering, laying out the facts of Burke's treachery and Pike's predatory greed with cold, simple clarity. Boone had listened without comment, his face a mask in the flickering light, but when she finished, he had given a single, slow nod. It was all the validation she needed. He was cleaning his revolver. He did it with a slow, methodical ritual that she understood was not about preparing for violence, but about finding a center in a familiar task. The pieces of the Colt lay on a clean oilcloth, the cylinder, the barrel, the frame. He worked with a soft rag and a small tin of oil, his hands moving with the deep, ingrained knowledge of a man who understood his tools. Each click of the metal as he reassembled the weapon was a sharp, definitive sound in the heavy silence. She watched his hands. They were the same hands that had patiently shown her the clove hitch, the same hands that had gently applied salve to her injured foot, the same hands that had held a window frame against a storm. Tonight, they were reassembling a weapon. The contradiction was a tight knot in her chest. Everything about him was a contradiction, the quiet solitude and the fierce protectiveness, the capacity for swift, decisive action and the profound, patient respect. He was gentle with her, handling her as if she were a spooked mare, liable to bolt at any sudden movement. He had built a fortress of consideration around her, and while she had needed it to heal, tonight, it felt like another kind of cage. He finished his work. The revolver was whole again, its blued steel gleaming in the lamplight. He set it down on the table between them, a dark, heavy weight of potential. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. "You should get some sleep," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Tomorrow will be a long day." I can't sleep, she replied, her voice just as quiet. My mind won't stop turning. He nodded, understanding. It's the waiting. It's always the hardest part. He had been so careful with her. Every gesture, every word, had been measured, offering comfort but never demanding anything. He had given her space to breathe, to stand, to find her own strength. He treated her like something precious and fragile. And she knew, with a sudden, startling clarity, that she was done with being fragile. She had survived Burke. She had faced Pike. She was not a piece of delicate glass. She was iron that had been through the fire. She looked at him, at the quiet strength in his face, at the deep well of loneliness in his eyes that she recognized because it mirrored her own. She looked at the gun on the table, a symbol of the world they were fighting, and then back at him, the man who was her only shield against it. I don't want gentle, she said. The words fell into the stillness, sharp and unexpected. Boone's expression didn't change, but a new kind of watchfulness came into his eyes. He misunderstood. She could see it. He thought she was speaking of the fight to come, that she was asking him to be ruthless on her behalf. It's not what I mean, she said, shaking her head. With you, I don't want you to be gentle. Not anymore. She took a breath, the words coming in a rush. A truth she had only just admitted to herself. Being gentle is what you do for something that's broken. It's what you do when you're afraid you'll cause more pain. She leaned forward, her voice dropping, fierce and raw. I am not broken, Boone, and I don't want fear to be the thing that defines us. I don't want to be afraid of this. She gestured to the small space between them, a space that was charged with all the things they had never said. Not anymore. It was not a demand for roughness. It was a plea for wholeness. It was a declaration that she was ready to meet him as an equal, with a passion that was as strong and defiant as their stand against Pike. She was done being the survivor he was protecting. She wanted to be the partner who stood beside him, in every sense. Boone stared at her, the meaning of her words slowly dawning in his eyes. He saw the fierce pride in her, the courage that had carried her this far. He saw that his careful, protective gentleness, which had been a necessary balm for her wounds, had become a barrier. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up. He didn't reach for her. He unbuckled his gun belt. The heavy leather slid from his hips with a soft sigh. He walked to the wall, to the peg where it usually hung. He coiled the belt and hung the holstered revolver on its peg. The act was symbolic, a statement clearer than any words. He was disarming himself. He was consciously setting aside the tool of his violent past, the emblem of his solitude and self-reliance. He was choosing to face her with his hands empty, with no shield and no weapon. He was choosing vulnerability. He was choosing to trust. He walked back to the table and stood before her. He looked down at her, the lamplight carving deep shadows into the planes of his face. He was just a man, strong and flawed and achingly real. He asked her one last time, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. Are you sure she didn't need words? She rose from her chair, closing the final inch of distance between them. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the thick, clean hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled his face down to hers. She kissed him. It was not a hesitant, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of certainty, a claim she had been waiting her whole life to make. It was the taste of coffee and dust and loneliness and a strength she hadn't known she possessed. For a heartbeat, he was still a statue of surprise. And then his hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. And he was kissing her back. It was a deep, searing kiss that spoke of long repressed hunger and a profound, desperate need for connection. It was a kiss that acknowledged the darkness they had both lived in and a silent, fervent promise of a shared light. His arms went around her, pulling her against the hard, solid wall of his chest, and she melted into him, a lifetime of tension and fear dissolving in the heat of his embrace. Her hands clung to his shoulders, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. The imaginative camera of the moment saw only this two figures, lost in the circle of each other's arms. their hands clasped, their bodies pressed close, finding a sanctuary in the heart of a storm. The window was open a crack, and a soft breeze, finally stirring from its slumber, drifted into the room. It carried the wild, clean scent of crushed sage and the cool, dark smell of damp earth. Smoothly, a hand reached out and turned down the wick of the oil lamp. The golden flame shrank, sputtered, and died, plunging the room into shadow. The moonlight streaming through the window was just bright enough to silhouette their two forms as they moved as one, their shadows merging on the wall before the scene faded completely to black. The first light of dawn was a pale, pearlescent gray, filtering into the quiet kitchen. The air was cold. The smell of fresh coffee was already beginning to fill the small house. They moved around each other with a new, quiet economy of motion. There were no grand declarations, no whispered promises. The intimacy of the night had not transformed them into starry-eyed lovers. It had forged them into something stronger. They were allies, their bond now tempered by a different kind of fire. Alara stood by the window, her back to him, tying her hair back with a piece of twine. She had found a pencil stub and, with a practiced motion, tucked it behind her ear. Her statement was in her shirt pocket, the folded paper a solid weight against her ribs. Boone came and stood beside her, handing her a steaming tin cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed. It was a simple, casual contact, but it sent a current of warmth through her. She looked out at the pre-dawn landscape. Marrow, the sorrel, let out a soft whicker from the corral, his breath pluming in the cold air. The world had not changed. Pike was still out there. The fight was still ahead, but everything felt different. The world still tilted toward injustice, but she was no longer facing it alone. She felt Boone's presence beside her, solid and reassuring. She touched the paper in her pocket, the carbon copy of Burke's ledger. "We carry fire," she whispered to herself, a mantra against the coming day. "Not fear." Boone watched her, seeing the steel in her spine, the resolve in the set of her jaw. He reached out and gently touched his fingers to her temple, a brief, tender gesture that was more intimate than a kiss. It was a blessing, a benediction, a soldier's salute before a battle. "I'll see you in court," his eyes said. He took a deep breath of the cold morning air, the scent of coffee and wood smoke filling his lungs. He had spent years of his life with a gun on his hip, living by a code that demanded a man be ready to draw his weapon to defend his life and his honor. But last night, he had learned a different kind of courage. He looked at the woman beside him, her face illuminated by the fragile hope of the new day. Loving her, he thought, was about learning to disarm himself before he drew the law. It was the only way to truly win. Orrin Pike was a man who understood pressure. He knew that a legal document, like a branding iron, was only as good as the force applied behind it. With the harvest moon approaching and the town's sentiment slowly turning into a dangerous, unpredictable current, he began to apply pressure. His first move was to purchase the loyalty of Jory Madsen, the county clerk's young, perpetually indebted assistant. A few silver dollars in a smoke-filled back room were enough to secure a future witness who would swear he had seen Alara signing a labor contract of her own free will. His second move was more direct. He sent for the Black Arroyo Riders, a group of hard cases who worked for hire, specializing in the kind of trouble that couldn't be traced back to a respectable businessman. Their task was not to attack the ranch, but to bleed its reputation. The sound came in the dead of night, a sharp, percussive crack of splintering wood that tore through the deep silence. Alara sat bolt upright in the small bedroom, her heart instantly pounding. Boone was already on his feet in the main room, pulling on his boots, the rifle in his hand. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Lock the door behind me." He slipped out into the moonless dark. Alara did as she was told, her ear pressed to the thick wood of the door. She heard the sound again, farther off now, than the thunder of a dozen shod hooves, fading quickly to the north. It wasn't an attack, it was vandalism, malice. When Boone returned an hour later, he was not angry. He was cold, methodical. He carried a bucket containing a milky white substance. "The entire north fence line is down," he said, setting the bucket on the porch. 300 yards of it. They drove a small herd of Mustangs through it to make it look like an accident. "We have to ride after them," Alara said, her fists clenched. "No." Boone shook his head. "That's what Pike wants. He wants me chasing shadows in the dark, looking like a hothead. He wants me to leave you here alone. He wants me tired and angry for the hearing." He picked up a brush. "We play our game, not his." He led her out, carrying a lantern. The damage was immense. Posts were shattered. The wire snapped and coiled like dead snakes. And in the soft dirt, the hoof prints were a chaotic mess. Boone knelt, dipping his brush into the bucket of lime wash. "Ada will need evidence that this wasn't wild horses," he said. He began to carefully paint a white ring around a single, clear hoof print. "See this a nick on the inside edge? That's a thrown shoe, hastily reset. A rancher would fix that properly. A rider in a hurry wouldn't." He moved to another set of prints. "And these are shod with iron from the mesquite smithy. Different ore, different shape from the shoes we use in Calico Bend." He worked for an hour, a grim artist painting circles of white under the starlight. He wasn't just marking evidence. He was turning Pike's act of aggression into a calculated legal response. He was refusing to meet violence with violence, choosing instead to meet it with fact. Pike's next assault was psychological. 2 days later, a new document appeared in Calico Bend. It wasn't an official warrant, but a printed handbill, distributed at the saloon and the mercantile. It was a supposed statement, an affidavit declaring that Alara Vance had left her stepfather's care voluntarily and had taken up residence with Boone Ashford as his common-law wife, and that the charges against Mr. Pike were a fabrication to cover for their scandalous arrangement. When Silas the mailman brought them a copy, his face a mixture of apology and avid curiosity, Alara's hands began to shake as she read it. The words were a vile poison, twisting her flight for freedom into a sordid affair. But as her eyes scanned the text, the shaking stopped. A cold, sharp focus took its place. She pointed to a word in the middle of a sentence. The word was agreement. "Look," she said, her voice tight. "The R." Boone leaned closer. The typeface was a standard serif, but the capital R was flawed. It had a long, slightly ostentatious tail that curled back on itself, a flourish not present in the rest of the font. It was the printer's tell, the distinctive, imperfect signature of Luther Quayle. "He's getting desperate," Boone said. "He's using the same man for his lies that he used for his forgeries." Alara folded the handbill. "I'm going to see him. We'll go together." "No," she insisted, her eyes meeting his. "He's afraid of you. He's afraid of Pike, but he might listen to me. This started because I was treated like property. I need to be the one to prove I'm not." He saw the unshakable resolve in her face and knew he couldn't argue. He had seen that look before in Ada Graves. In the mirror, it was the look of someone who had chosen their ground. She found Luther Quayle in his shop, sweeping ink-stained dust into a corner, his movements jerky and fearful. The bell above the door made him jump as if a shot had been fired. "Miss Vance," he stammered, his eyes darting to the street outside. I can't talk to you. You shouldn't be here. I know you're afraid. Mr. Quayle," she said, her voice soft. She closed the door behind her, shutting out the street. "I know, mister. Pike has made threats. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you a choice." "I have no choice," he whispered, wringing his ink-stained hands. "He'll ruin me, or worse, he will ruin you anyway," Alara said, her voice hardening slightly. "Men like Pike always discard their tools when they're done. But you can choose how you fall. You can fall as his accomplice, or you can stand as a man who told the truth." She took a step closer. "Marshall Graves knows you printed that handbill. She knows you printed the false bill of sale. She can protect you. A jail cell in the territorial capital is a lot safer than being Pike's loose end." She was not just appealing to his conscience. She was offering him a lifeline, framing the truth not as a moral victory, but as a strategic survival plan. Quayle stared at her, his face a miserable battleground of fear and shame. He looked at his press, the source of his livelihood. Now the instrument of his potential damnation. His shoulders slumped, conscience, bolstered by logic, finally won. Without a word, he walked to the back of the shop, to a large wooden case filled with hundreds of tiny compartments, each holding a different letter of lead type. He reached into a drawer beneath it and pulled out a small, heavy wooden box. He set it on the counter between them. "This is the font he paid me to use for his private documents," Quayle said, his voice a dead monotone. He said he wanted something that looked official, but was unique. Ilara opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet slots, were the lead letters. She found the capital R. She held the small, cold piece of metal up to the light. There, on the bottom edge of the letter's tail, was a tiny, hairline fracture in the lead, a flaw that would transfer to the paper with every press. It was the physical twin to the image on Boone's carbon copy. It was the nail for Pike's coffin. Pike, feeling the tide turn, unleashed his final weapon rumor. He paid for rounds of drinks at the Calico Nugget, and his men, Jed and Amos, circulated through the crowd, poisoning the well. They painted Ilara as a liar, a woman of loose morals who had tricked the simple-minded rancher into harboring her, a schemer trying to extort money from an honest businessman. The next time Ilara and Boone walked into the saloon, the air was thick with hostility. The whispers were louder, the stares harder. "There she is," a voice slurred from the bar. "Pike's expensive doxy." Boone's hand dropped to his gun, his body going rigid. But before he could speak, Ilara put a hand on his arm. "No," she murmured. "My turn." She let go of his arm and walked to the center of the room. She stood by the pot-bellied stove, her hands empty at her sides, and waited. The room slowly fell silent, the men drawn in by the sheer, unexpected audacity of her stance. "I hear you've all been talking about me," she said, her voice not loud, but clear and carrying. It didn't tremble. "I'm sure, mister, Pike's whiskey has made the stories very colorful, so I thought you should hear the truth, not from a man who profits from it, but from me." She told them everything. She spoke of Burke's gambling, of the debt. She described the fraudulent document, the one with the broken winged eagle seal. She told them about the confrontation at the ranch, about Deputy Finch reading from a paper that did not have her name on it. She spoke of the fence and of the lying handbill printed with a flawed letter. She laid out the facts, one by one, like stones in a foundation. She did not cry. She did not plead for their sympathy. She presented her testimony, treating them not as a drunken mob, but as a jury. "Mister, Pike wants you to believe this is a story about my character," she concluded, her eyes sweeping the room, meeting the gaze of every man who would look at her. "He is wrong. This is a story about it is a story about a man who believes his money gives him the right to own another person's life. Tomorrow, at the hearing, you will see the evidence. Today, I just wanted you to see me." She finished speaking. The silence that followed was a different kind from the one that had greeted her. It was heavy with thought, with the uncomfortable weight of men forced to reconsider what they'd been so quick to believe. Boone had come in halfway through her speech. He had stopped just inside the doors, leaning against the frame, and had listened. He watched her stand alone in the center of that hostile room, armed with nothing but the truth, and hold them all captive. He saw her, not as the terrified woman who had collapsed on his porch, but as a pillar, as strong and unyielding as the posts that held up his home. He felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost buckled his knees. He finally, completely, understood. She didn't need a savior. She needed an ally to stand beside her. As Ilara turned to walk back to him, Marshal Ada Graves stepped into the saloon. She had been listening from outside. "Well said, Miss Vance," Ada said, her voice cutting through the quiet. She pinned a notice to the board by the door. "For those of you interested in the truth, the public hearing will be held tomorrow, high noon, in the town hall. Judge Thorne will preside." She turned, her gaze sweeping the room. "I chose noon for a reason. So no one has to hide in the shadows. Just then, the territorial express rider clattered to a halt outside. He brought a letter for the marshal's office. Ada read it, and a grim, satisfied smile touched her lips. "Well, Pike's having a bad week," she announced to the room at large. "This is from Marshal Kane in the next county. Seems they're investigating Orrin Pike for violations of the Peonage Act. Got a half-dozen field hands who claim he's been holding them in forced labor to pay off manufactured debts." The net was closing. As Boone and Alara left the saloon, a figure detached itself from the deep shadows of the alley beside the mercantile. It was Burke Talon. He looked like a ghost, his clothes rumpled, his face gaunt with fear and cheap whiskey. "Alara," he rasped, rushing toward her. "You have to help me. Pike's men are looking for me. They say I'm a liability. You have to tell the marshal it was all a misunderstanding." He reached for her arm. Alara stepped back, out of his reach. All the fear and pain he had caused her rose up, but she met it with a cold, hard calm. She was no longer his victim. There was no misunderstanding. "Burke," she said, her voice level. "You sold me. You know it, and I know it. But I was desperate. He tricked me. Your desperation is not my problem anymore." She said. She looked him in the eye, drawing a final, unbreakable line. "If you want any hope of leniency from the judge, you will walk into that office right now. You will turn yourself in, and you will write a full confession of your deal with Orrin Pike. That is your only choice." She turned and walked away, Boone falling into step beside her. She didn't look back. They stopped in the middle of the street, the town hall looming before them, its windows dark and waiting. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes. High above the town, a flock of swallows wheeled and turned in the evening air, their synchronized flight a swirling, complex dance against the darkening sky. They swooped low over the roof of Quayle's print shop, their chittering cries filling the air. The town was holding its breath, preparing itself to finally look at the truth in the bright, unforgiving light of day. The attack came not with the crack of a rifle, but with a low, terrifying rumble that grew from the earth itself. It was the sound of thunder on a cloudless dawn, the sound of a river of hooves. Boone was already moving before the first panicked cry from his cattle reached the house. He burst out onto the porch, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the eastern pasture where the gray light of morning was just beginning to touch the land. What he saw was a nightmare. A dozen riders, the Black Arroyo gang by their dark kerchiefs, were weaving through his herd, whooping and firing their pistols into the air. They weren't trying to rustle the cattle. They were trying to stampede them, and they were driving them straight for Gravel-Tongue Gulch, a deep, rock-strewn ravine where a panicked herd would pile up and destroy itself. It was a calculated, ruinous act designed to do one thing: keep him here, fighting for his livelihood, until it was too late to appear in court. "They're running them into the gulch." Boone's voice was a raw, angry bark. He was already sprinting for the corral, for Marrow, the law, the hearing. His own safety had all vanished. His life's work, every animal he had painstakingly raised on this unforgiving land, was about to be driven over a cliff. Alara stood frozen in the doorway, the sheer, malicious chaos of the scene threatening to overwhelm her. She could see the dust cloud boiling up, hear the terrified bawling of the cows and calves. This was it, Pike's final move, a brute force attack to wipe them off the board. She felt a surge of helpless rage. They were 2 people against a dozen. Then, her eyes fell on the porch post. Hanging from a leather thong was a small, tarnished brass horn. Boone had told her about it. It was an old signal horn, used in his cavalry days to sound a charge or a retreat, now repurposed to call his cattle from the far pastures. But the ranchers in the valley had an agreement. 3 long blasts from a horn like that was a signal for dire emergency. Fire, attack, a call for all hands. Boone was already swinging into Marrow's saddle, his face a grim mask of concentration, focused solely on the herd. He was one man against a stampede. He couldn't fight the riders and save his cattle. Alara made the decision in a heartbeat. She snatched the horn from the post. Her hands were trembling, but her purpose was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She raised the horn to her lips, took a deep, shuddering breath, and blew. The sound that ripped through the dawn air was not a cry of fear. It was a clear, sharp, clarion call of defiance. It echoed off the face of Kestrel Bluff, a long, piercing note that cut through the noise of the stampede. She blew again, and then a third time, pouring all of her fear and fury into the sound. We are here. We are under attack. We will not fall alone. Help, if it came, would not be instant. The neighboring ranches were miles apart, but the sound had gone out. The summons had been issued. She watched as Boone, now a distant figure, galloped not toward the riders, but in a wide, desperate arc, trying to get ahead of the lead steers. He and Marrow moved as one being, a flash of sorrel and determined grit against a backdrop of brown, churning chaos. The community answered. The first to arrive was a single rider from the south, Old Man Martinez, his face grim, a heavy stock whip coiled in his hand. Then, from the west, a buckboard wagon rattled up, carrying Olafsson, the big Swede who ran the farm down by the creek, and his two strapping sons. They were not carrying rifles. They were carrying the tools of their lives, hay forks with long, sharp tines, and heavy, broad-bladed shovels. They were farmers, not fighters, but their faces were set with the stubborn resolution of men defending their own. They pulled up near the house, their eyes taking in the scene. Olafsson jumped down from the wagon. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The horn. Where do you need us?" "They're trying to keep him from the hearing," she said, pointing to Boone's distant struggle. "They want to destroy his herd and tie him up here. More were arriving now. 2 more ranchers with lariats, another farmer on a mule, a small, grim army of homesteaders, drawn together by 3 notes on a brass horn. They formed a loose, ragged line in front of the ranch house, facing the chaos. They were a shield made of ordinary men, their work tools held at the ready. Boone, meanwhile, was performing a miracle of horsemanship. He had reached the head of the stampede. The ground was treacherous, littered with rocks and sagebrush. A single misstep would mean death beneath 1,000 hooves. But he pushed Marrow into the thick of it, riding alongside the terrified lead steer, a big, wild-eyed longhorn. He wasn't yelling. He was talking to it, his voice a low, urgent murmur, using his body and the pressure of his horse to slowly, painstakingly, begin to turn the animal's head away from the ravine. The Black Arroyo riders saw the line of farmers forming. They saw their plan to isolate Boone failing. Their leader, a man with a scarred face that Alara recognized from Pike's first visit, spurred his horse toward the gathering. "This ain't your business." "Sodbusters," he yelled, drawing his revolver. "Turn that wagon and ride out, or we'll plant you with your own crops." Before Olafsson or Martinez could answer, a new sound cut through the air, the sharp, authoritative clang of a heavy bell. Marshal Ada Graves, mounted on a big roan, rode into the yard, followed by 2 young, grim-faced deputies. Ada did not draw her weapon. She reined in, her salt-white hair catching the morning sun, and held up one hand. "Jedediah Stone," she called out, her voice cracking like a whip. Her eyes were locked on the rider's leader. "I recognize you, and I recognize the brand on that saddle. The Black Arroyo. By authority of the territorial government, I am declaring this an unlawful armed assembly with intent to riot and cause criminal damage. I'm ordering you and your men to drop your weapons. Now," Jed Stone sneered. "You and what army, old woman? The army of every decent man in this valley who is sick of bullies like you and the man who pays you," Ada shot back. "And the army of the law, which says I can deputize every one of them right now. You have 10 seconds to drop those guns before I charge you with armed insurrection." The riders hesitated, their confidence faltering. They had been hired to terrorize a lone rancher, not to fight a whole community and the law. One of the younger riders, seeing the hayforks and the marshal's deputies, began to back his horse away. Jed Stone saw his control slipping. In a snarl of pure frustration, he abandoned the larger fight and spurred his horse directly at the line of farmers. aiming for the person who had started this. He aimed for Alara. He didn't draw his gun. He drew a long, wicked-looking skinning knife from his belt, the blade glinting. He was going to make an example of her. Alara stood her ground. There was nowhere to run. The heavy rein from Martinez's horse lay coiled on the ground near her feet. As Jed's horse thundered toward her, she bent, scooped up the thick leather strap, and swung it. It was not a wild, panicked lash. It was a single, focused, deliberate act of self-preservation. The heavy, braided end of the rein whistled through the air and wrapped around Jed Stone's wrist just as he raised the knife. The impact sent a jolt of pain up his arm, his fingers spasming open. The knife flew from his grasp and buried its tip in the dirt. He howled, more in surprise than in pain, and yanked his horse to a halt, clutching his stinging hand. The standoff was broken. The fight had gone out of them. Seeing their leader disarmed by the very woman they had come to intimidate, the Black Arroyo riders turned and fled, a disorganized rabble scattering back toward the Mesquite Divide. Ada's deputies gave a short, half-hearted pursuit before returning. The immediate threat was gone, but the herd was still a river of panicked flesh, moving away from the gulch but still dangerously out of control. Boone had succeeded in turning them, but now he had to calm them. He guided them toward a wide, shallow box canyon to the west, a place called Coyote Hollow. He rode to the mouth of the canyon, then dismounted. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, heavy brass handbell. He began to ring it. The sound was clear and melodic, a steady, rhythmic clang, clang, clang. It was the same bell he used to call them to feed, the same bell that signaled water and safety. He stood his ground at the mouth of the canyon, ringing the bell, his voice now a low, calming chant. The lid steers, their eyes still wild with terror, heard the sound. They slowed, their heads coming up. The familiar bell cut through their panic. It was a promise of safety. One by one, they turned and began to file into the broad, grassy expanse of Coyote Hollow, the art of the cowboy. Alara realized, was not in the gun or the rope. It was in the quiet understanding of a living creature, in the power of a single, trusted sound to bring order to chaos. As the last of the cattle moved into the canyon, the riders were long gone. Ada walked over to where Jed Stone's knife still stuck in the ground. She pulled it free, examined it, and then saw something else on the ground. It was a dark blue kerchief, marked with the crude, stitched image of a scorpion, the insignia of the Black Arroyo riders. She picked it up and folded it carefully. Evidence. The adrenaline that had sustained Alara for the past hour drained away in a sudden, sickening rush. Her knees buckled, the world swam in a gray haze, and she sank to the ground, the brass horn falling from her limp fingers. The fight was over. They had won. A moment later, Boone was there. He knelt in the dust beside her. His face was streaked with dirt, his shirt soaked with sweat, his eyes etched with a bone-deep weariness. But he was there. He didn't speak. He just held out his hand, palm up. It was not a command. It was a question, an invitation. She looked at his hand, then at his face. She nodded. She placed her hand in his, and he helped her to her feet. They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the quiet, weary gratitude of their neighbors. They were both covered in a fine layer of dust and grime, their faces grim with exhaustion. They had protected their land. They had defended their dignity. And in the clear, bright light of the morning, covered in the honest dirt of their struggle, they had never looked more beautiful. And then, from the town of Calico Bend, another sound began to drift across the plains, clear and resonant on the morning air. It was the slow, steady tolling of the church bell. 1, 2, 3 times. It was the summons. It was high noon. The hearing was about to begin. The Calico Bend Town Hall was not a courtroom. It was a large, drafty wooden hall that smelled of pine floorboards, sweat, and the faint, lingering scent of last week's Grange dance. On this day, it was packed to the rafters. Every bench was full, and men stood 3 deep along the back and side walls, farmers in their Sunday best, ranchers with the dust of the trail still on their boots, miners from the nearby hills, and the town's merchants. They were all there. This was not just a legal hearing. It was a public reckoning. At the front of the hall, a long trestle table served as the bench for Judge Elias Thorne, a circuit judge with a face like a weathered granite cliff and eyes that had seen 70 years of frontier justice. To his left sat Marshal Ada Graves, her posture as rigid as a rifle barrel. To his right, Boone and Alara sat at a small, scarred table. Alara's folded statement and the box of lead type sat before her. Boone's hands rested on his knees, his face unreadable, a study in coiled stillness. At the opposite table sat Orrin Pike. He was not alone. Beside him was a slick, overdressed lawyer from the territorial capital, a man named Sterling who exuded an oily confidence. Pike himself was freshly barbered and wearing a new suit. He leaned back in his chair, a smug, proprietary smile on his face. He looked like a man who had already purchased the verdict. Judge Thorne banged a heavy wooden gavel. "This hearing is now in session," he announced, his voice a gravelly boom that silenced the last of the murmurs. "The matter before us is a writ of seizure filed by Mr. Orrin Pike for the return of disputed property, currently residing at the Dry Lantern Ranch, under the protection of Mr. Boone Ashford." Pike's lawyer, Sterling, rose smoothly. "Your Honor, we are prepared to present a new, fully executed order, signed and sealed by a magistrate of the Mesquite Divide District, affirming my client's lawful claim." He produced a document with a flourish, a document far more impressive than the last one. It was thick, creamy paper, covered in ornate script, and at the bottom was a large, crisp wax seal. He handed it to Marshal Graves, who examined it briefly before passing it to the judge. Pike's smirk widened. He had corrected his earlier mistake. He had brought the right paper this time, a paper backed by a bought and paid-for magistrate. He believed the fight was already over. Judge Thorne studied the document, his heavy brows furrowed. "This appears to be an order, on the surface." He looked over at Ada. "Marshal, you contested the initial claim. Do you contest this one?" "I do." "Your Honor," Ada said, her voice sharp. She stood. "On the grounds that this document, like the ones that preceded it, is a product of fraud and conspiracy." Sterling scoffed. "A baseless accusation." "Your Honor, the seal is authentic. The signature is valid." "The seal may be authentic," Ada conceded, "but the document itself was printed on a press that has been used to create forgeries." She turned her head slightly. "Miss Vance, it was the cue." Alara stood, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She felt the eyes of the entire town on her. She picked up the carbon copy of Burke's ledger and the small wooden box. She walked to the judge's table. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. "This is a copy of my stepfather's private ledger. It details the true nature of his agreement with Mr. Pike, an agreement to trade a living asset me for a gambling debt." She handed him the carbon copy. Sterling leaped to his feet. "Objection, that is a fabrication. It could have been written by anyone." "And this," Alara continued, ignoring him, as she placed the wooden box on the table, "is the lead type used to print Mr. Pike's documents, including the handbill he circulated slandering my name, and, I believe, the very writ you now hold." She opened the box. "If you examine the capital letter R, you will find a small, hairline fracture in the lead, a flaw that leaves a unique mark. I believe you will find that same flaw on all of Mr. Pike's papers." A ripple of excitement went through the crowd. Judge Thorne took a small magnifying glass from his coat pocket. He looked at the writ. He looked at the handbill Ada provided. He looked at the tiny, cold piece of lead Alara indicated. He was silent for a full minute. "The flaw matches," he said finally, his voice flat. He looked down the hall. "Luther Quayle, please come forward." The printer shuffled to the front of the hall, his face the color of ash. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. Ada had him place his hand on a Bible. "Mr. Quayle," Ada said, her voice not unkind, "did you, or did you not, print this writ for Mr. Orrin Pike?" Quayle swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He shot a terrified glance at Pike, who was now staring at him with undisguised menace. But then he looked at Alara, who met his gaze with a look of quiet encouragement. "I did," Quayle whispered, his voice cracking. He paid me. He provided the paper and the seal. He told me what to write. He paid me to print the handbill, too, and the first bill of sale, the one that named Miss Vance. And who paid you for this work?" "Mr. Quayle." "He did," Quayle said, finally lifting a trembling finger and pointing it directly at Orrin Pike. Pike's face was a thundercloud. Sterling was on his feet, shouting objections, but Judge Thorne waved him to silence. "Burke Talon," the judge called. 2 deputies brought Burke in from the marshal's office. He was sober, for once, and his face was a pasty mask of fear. He repeated his confession, his voice a miserable drone, telling of the gambling debt, the pressure from Pike, the signing of the document he knew was illegal. "He said he'd ruin me," Burke finished, his eyes on the floor. "He said I had no choice." Ada Graves stood. "Your Honor, let the record show that Mr. Talon admits to his part in this. But let it also be understood by everyone in this hall, a man's debt does not grant another man title to his children. A human being cannot be collateral. That is not the law of this territory, and it is not the law of this country." The words resonated deeply with the crowd of farmers and ranchers, men who lived their entire lives under the shadow of the bank and the mercantile. A low murmur of agreement swept the room. Hezekiah Finch, the judge called next, the deputy registrar, his suit stained with fresh sweat, looked as if he might faint. Boone stood. "Your Honor, before Mr. Finch testifies, I would like to present this." He walked forward and handed the judge the simple, handwritten statement Finch had signed at the ranch 2 days prior. "This is a document written and signed by Mr. Finch," Boone said, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "In it, he attests that he came to my property to execute a seizure based on a document that did not contain Miss Vance's name. I would like to ask Mr. Finch if this is, in fact, his signature." All eyes turned to Finch, trapped by Boone's foresight, cornered by his own handwriting. He collapsed. "He paid me," Finch blubbered, tears streaming down his face. "Pike paid me $50 to look the other way, to validate whatever papers he brought. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." The room erupted. Judge Thorne hammered his gavel for order. Pike's smug confidence had completely vanished, replaced by a mask of incandescent rage. His carefully constructed legal fortress had crumbled into dust. Ada Graves let the noise die down. Then she addressed the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. This was not a simple debt collection. This was a conspiracy to commit fraud, to engage in peonage, and to subvert the law of this county through bribery and intimidation. The events of this morning, when Mr. Pike hired the Black Arroyo riders to stampede Mr. Ashford's herd in an attempt to prevent him from appearing here today, only confirm his criminal intent." She held up a copy of the federal statutes. Furthermore, under the Peonage Abolition Act of 1867, the act of holding any person to a condition of compulsory service to repay a debt is a federal crime. This is no longer a local matter. The mention of federal law sent a chill through the room. This was bigger than they had thought. Pike could contain himself no longer. He surged to his feet, knocking his chair over, his face purple with fury. His lawyer tried to grab his arm, but Pike shook him off. "This is a farce," he roared, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent hall. He pointed a thick, trembling finger at Alara. "You'll listen to the word of this? This runaway, a scheming woman who abandoned her own family to shack up with this reclusive old gunslinger. Look at her, she manipulated all of you. She played on Ashford's loneliness, twisting him around her finger to steal from me. She is a liar and a tramp, and her word is worthless." The attack was vicious, personal, and designed to strip Alara of the dignity she had fought so hard to reclaim. A wave of shock and revulsion went through the crowd. Boone started to rise, his eyes blazing, but Alara put a hand on his arm, holding him in his seat. She stood up. She did not look angry. She did not look hurt. She looked calm, her back straight, her chin high. She did not look at the judge or the jury of faces in the crowd. She looked directly, and only, at Orrin Pike. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it filled the hall, clear and cold as a winter morning. "Mr. Pike," she said, "you have spent this entire time talking about my value, my cost, what I am worth. You have tried to buy me, to seize me, to trade me. You are mistaken." She paused, letting the silence draw taut. "I have a name. I do not have a price." The simple, powerful truth of her words landed like a physical blow. The crowd, which had been a volatile, uncertain mob, was now united. Their silence was no longer one of shock, but of profound, unwavering respect. They were not looking at a piece of property. They were looking at Alara Vance. Judge Thorne had heard enough. He looked at the panel of local ranchers he'd informally designated as an advisory jury. He looked at Old Man Martinez and at Olafson the Swede. Olafson stood, his massive frame seeming to fill the front of the hall. He looked at the judge, then turned and looked at Orrin Pike. "Judge," Olafson said, his voice a deep, quiet rumble. "His paper is trash." A roar of approval went up from the crowd. Judge Thorne banged his gavel. "This court agrees. The writ is dismissed. Mr. Pike's claim is declared null and void." But before Pike could even begin to process his defeat, Ada Graves stepped forward. She held a new document in her hand. It was not a writ. It was an arrest warrant. "Orrin Pike," she declared, her voice ringing with the authority of the law. "By the power vested in me by the territory, I am placing you under arrest. The charges are conspiracy to commit fraud, suborning perjury, bribery of a public official, and violation of the Federal Peonage Act. Your case will be referred to the territorial prosecutor." Her two deputies moved in. Taking a stunned, sputtering Pike by the arms, his power, his money, his reputation, it had all evaporated in an instant. He was just a criminal, being led away in disgrace. The hall erupted, people standing on benches, cheering, clapping. The noise was a tidal wave of release and communal victory. The farmers and ranchers swarmed around Boone and Alara, clapping them on the back, shaking their hands. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, taking their excitement and their stories out into the noon sun. Soon, the hall was empty, save for the two of them. They stood in the sudden, echoing quiet, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light slanting through the high windows. Alara turned to Boone. He looked back at her. There were no words. There was no triumphant embrace. There was only the profound, bone-deep, shuddering relief of two people who had walked through a desert of fear and had, together, finally reached the other side. They stood in the quiet hall, and in the same, shared instant, they both let out a long, slow breath. The battle was over. Night fell on the Dry Lantern Ranch not as a blanket of smothering darkness, but as a soft, velvet curtain. The moon, now full and luminous, rose over the valley, bathing the hard-scrabble land in a light so pure and silver it felt like a benediction. The air was cool and still, scrubbed clean by the winds of the past few days, and the only sounds were the soft cropping of the cattle, safe in Coyote Hollow, and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Boone stood in the stable, the warm, familiar scent of hay and horseflesh, a comforting balm. Marrow nickered softly as Boone ran a hand down the sorrel's flank. From a peg on the wall, he took down the small, heavy brass handbell, the one he had used to calm the stampede. He walked back to the house and stepped onto the porch. He didn't go inside. Instead, he walked to the thick wooden peg by the door where his gunbelt hung. The Colt revolver, cleaned and oiled, rested heavy in its holster. A sleeping predator. For years, that gun had been the final word in any argument, the ultimate tool of self-reliance, the symbol of a life lived on the edge of violence. Beside it, he now hung the bell, looping its leather thong over the same peg. The two objects, side by side, formed a silent testament. One was an instrument of force, a promise of a swift and violent end. The other was an instrument of care, a promise of safety and sustenance. One was for protection by taking a life, the other for protection by preserving one. He had used his mind and his heart to win this fight, not just his hand. He stepped back, looking at them, a man acknowledging the two sides of himself and the conscious choice he had made between them. They were not alone for long. As dusk deepened, a parade of lanterns began to snake its way up the track to the ranch. It was the neighbors. Olafsson, the Swede, and his sons arrived first in their buckboard, the wagon bed now holding a steaming pot of stew and a basket of fresh-baked bread. Old man Martinez followed on his horse, a brace of chickens slung over his saddle. Others came, bringing coffee, pies, and the simple, profound gift of their presence. They gathered in the yard, a small, weary, triumphant community lit by a half-dozen flickering lanterns. They didn't speak of the hearing, not directly. They spoke of the price of feed, of the coming winter, of the fence line they would all help Boone mend come the weekend. But the relief was a palpable thing, a shared warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee they were drinking. Marshal Ada Graves rode in last, her face tired but content in the lantern light. She accepted a tin cup of coffee and held it up. The small crowd fell silent. "I've been the law in this territory for 20 years, she said, her dry voice carrying in the still night air. "I've seen men who are quick on the draw, and men who are quick with their mouths. They're a dime a dozen." She looked over the rim of her cup, her gaze finding Boone where he stood by the porch steps. What's rare is a man who knows the most powerful thing he can do with a gun is choose when to leave it on the wall. She raised her cup a little higher. To the man who knows when to put the gun down. A low murmur of "hear, hear" went through the group, and they drank. It was a toast to him, but also to themselves, to a community that had chosen law over lawlessness, unity over fear. As the neighbors celebrated at the ranch, a lone figure slipped out of the back of the Calico Bend jail. Burke Talon, his face a pale, haunted mask, was being escorted by a deputy to the midnight stage. He was being taken to the territorial prison to await his own trial. He would testify against Pike, and in return, the judge would likely be lenient. He would not be a free man for a long time. Alara was not there to see him go. She hadn't asked to. There was no satisfaction in watching his final humiliation, no triumph in his defeat. He was a ghost from a life that was no longer hers. Forgiveness was a currency she did not possess, and revenge was a fire that had burned itself out, leaving behind not ash, but the clear, cold ground of justice. She was content to let the law do its work. Her work was here. Later, after the last of the neighbors had departed, their lanterns bobbing away into the darkness, a deep quiet returned to the ranch. Alara and Boone stood on the porch, the single oil lamp on the table casting a warm, intimate glow. The tin spoons on their string chimed softly in a rising breeze. Alara reached out, her fingers tracing the worn, tooled leather of the gunbelt hanging on the wall. The metal of the trigger guard was cold beneath her touch. "That night," she said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the revolver. "The night before the hearing. I'll never forget the sound of you unbuckling this." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the lamplight. "Thank you for hanging it up." Boone moved to stand beside her. He looked at the gun, then at her. A slow, tired smile touched his lips. "From now on," he said, his voice a low, steady promise that resonated deeper than any legal verdict. "The first thing I'll put down is your fear." The words were a vow, a rewriting of their contract. He was no longer just her physical protector. He was the guardian of her peace. The wind gusted, sending the tin spoons into a brief, frantic, beautiful song. Far in the distance, the sharp, black silhouette of Kestrel Bluff stood against the moonlit sky like a great curtain that had finally fallen on the last act of a long and painful play. Alara turned from the wall, a new, practical light in her eyes. The past was settled. Now, it was time to build the future. "Boone," she began, her voice formal, a little nervous. I would like to stay, if you'll have me." He watched her, his heart suddenly tight in his chest. "Alara." "No, wait," she said, holding up a hand. "I want to be clear. I want to stay. But I want to earn my place. I'm a hard worker. You've seen that. I want you to hire me. For the coming season, at least, pay me a fair wage. I'll cook. I'll mend. I'll help with the stock. I will not be a charity case. I will not be a debt. She stood before him, proud and resolute. It was the most important declaration she had ever made. She was not asking to be kept. She was applying for a position. Her self-respect, forged in the fires of the past weeks, was the foundation upon which she would build her new life. It was the bedrock of any love they might share. Boone looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the fierce independence in her, the absolute need to stand on her own 2 feet. He understood completely. To argue, to simply say, "Stay with me," would be to disrespect the very strength he'd come to admire so deeply. "All right," he said, his voice solemn. "I'll hire you, room and board, and $10 a month, same as any top hand would get. You'll work hard." A brilliant, relieved smile broke across her face. "Thank you, but," he added, taking a half-step closer, his voice dropping, "that's my offer for the position of hired hand." He held her gaze, his gray eyes intense and utterly sincere. "There is another position available. The day you decide you want to change your title from hired hand to half-owner of this house, you just say so. That position is open, too. It will remain open for as long as you are here to fill it. It was an offer of a true and total partnership. A proposal laid out not in terms of romance, but of shared ownership, of an equal stake in a life together." Alara's smile softened, turning into something deep and knowing. She thought of her plea to him on this very porch, the night before the hearing. "It doesn't have to be gentle," she said, her voice a soft murmur, full of a shared, private meaning. "It just has to be real." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers, calloused and strong, intertwined with hers. They stood there on the porch steps, hand in hand, under the vast, star-dusted sky. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The quiet, steady beating of their 2 hearts, finally in rhythm with the gentle song of the wind, was a language all its own. The final image lingered, a portrait of peace, hard won. The oil lamp flickered, its golden light glinting on the polished brass of the cattle bell and the worn, dark steel of the gun that hung beside it. Finally, at rest. The ultimate revenge was not a bullet, but a verdict. The greatest victory was not a battle won, but a future reclaimed. And the brightest love was not a firework, but a steady flame, lit by the slow, deliberate striking of courage, dignity, and the profound grace of consent. Thank you for listening to this story. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to hear from you all and share our thoughts. Please consider subscribing to my channel. Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and support it further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.